Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to Recite Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Indian philosophy, we will be talking about an introduction to Sunyavada, philosophy of Buddhism. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Welcome viewers. Today we'll be talking about Sunyavada, the philosophy of Buddhism, and this philosophy, as the term itself suggests, talks about voidness of things or nothingness, generally speaking, of this world. But we'll come to that point later. Let's first of all begin with kind of a historical background of this particular view in Buddhism. The Sunyavada is believed to have been propounded by the famous Buddhist Acharya named Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna was born roughly around between 100 AD to 250 AD. And is considered to be amongst the most prominent prominent figures in Buddhist thought. But apart from that, we'll come to that point later. But before we start talking about Sunyavada philosophy of Buddhism, we need to talk generally about some of the main tenets of Buddhism. So, as we already know, Buddhism, the philosophy of Buddhism begins with Four Noble Truths, 12-link chain, and Eightfold Path. But even before we discuss some of these concepts, we need to look at some of the historical aspects of Sunyavada philosophy, because Sunyavada philosophy is considered or is categorized under Mahayana Buddhism. So, before we focus our attention on Sunyavada philosophy, we need to have a closer look at Hinayana and Mahayana distinction as we consider it in Buddhist philosophy. So, and in order to understand the difference between the these two schools of Buddhism, we need to go back to Buddha's Mahaparinirvana. So, after Buddha's death, the term used for that is Mahaparinirvana. As many of us would be aware, there was a certain kind of a difference of opinion amongst different disciples of Buddha. So some of them believed that because the reason for this difference of opinion was basically that after Buddha's death, his teachings needed to be compiled in a certain way that it looks like a proper system of thought. But the main problem here was that Buddha was at times speaking in Pali with certain other sort of philosophers. He was speaking in other language, and and also not only that, he was giving different answers to same questions at times, which was a part of what we call today as Upaya Kaushalya, or skill in means. So he considered a person approaching him for teaching as a person afflicted with pain, and since the cause of pain differs in different people, so he had a very personal kind of an approach towards the person who would come to him for knowing his views about a particular issue. So he would, depending upon the bent of mind of a person, he would give certain kind of answers to that person. So the problem overall here was that Buddha had given absolutely large number of discourses while he was visiting different parts of India. As we all know, he was visiting extensively in different parts of this country, and as I just said, depending upon what kind of gathering of people was there, he would answer. He would give different answers. He would present different views regarding particular issues. So the problem here was that a certain group of his disciples after his death thought that one of the easiest ways of compiling Buddha's teaching could be that we just simply try to remember and record what he said during these large number of meetings, large number of discourses that he had delivered at in different parts of India and abroad. So this was one way. And as we know that he was mainly speaking Pali, he didn't believe that Sanskrit is the only language in which philosophical thoughts could be properly put together. So since the language of masses at that time was Pali, most of the people, common people, understood only Pali. They wouldn't have direct access to Sanskrit texts. So he was speaking with them in Pali, in their own language, so that they understand it. They understand what he says in much directly. So a certain group of his students believed that just compiling these different discourses, recalling them from their memory, putting them together probably would do the job. So his teachings would be in that way put together for the rest of the world for the rest of the time. But then there was a certain other group of his students who believed that it was not what Buddha said which was really important. What was actually important was what Buddha did not say. His silence was equally important. So, as we know that Buddha was silent regarding many metaphysical questions, and so according to these set of disciples, this group of disciples, what Buddha didn't say, meaning his silence, was equally important. And they emphasized upon his silence part. So, but now the problem here would be that writing about what Buddha did not say, it's the most difficult thing probably to philosophize about. How do you philosophize about somebody's silence? But then also there is a reason for us to believe that Buddha was silent regarding certain questions, not because he didn't have answers to those questions. There must have been some specific reason why he was not willing to answer those questions, and it was precisely these reasons that were important for Mahayana philosophers. So, as we talked about it in our earlier lectures, there were certain questions which were metaphysical in nature, like where does the soul go after one's death? Is soul identical with body, and so on and so forth, about which Buddha was not so much willing to answer. And there were certain answers. These questions were called avyakrit questions, because these and any answers to them depended upon certain conditions. So all those answers would have been conditional. So in that sense, those answers could have led to some kind of misunderstanding, misapprehension on the part of the listener, who was likely to take them categorically. So this is why these avyakrit questions, Buddha would either not answer them or would answer them by another question, such that the question would be answered with the help of further questioning from on the part of the Buddha. And at times he would be completely silent, and the certain set of questions were called thapaniya, which means these were questions which should have been simply rejected. So this way, Buddha's silence was important for these set of philosophers. So they thought that it would be a good idea to talk about the voidness of things and to find out reasons, to focus on reasons why Buddha was silent about certain metaphysical questions, what could have been the reasons for his silence, and why he was probably against any kind of views. So there is a certain term that is used in both Hinayana and Mahayana literature, which is called ditti, which is the Pali cognate of the term drishti. So drishti, as we know, means a certain perspective, a certain way of looking at things. And very much like the Jaina philosophy of Sunyavada, Buddha also thought that whenever we try to put together what we know, the world as it is handed down to as we find it appearing before us, the moment we try to capitulate the truth of it in words, it is gone at that moment, because whenever we try to put it together in language, then we bring in the different conceptual frameworks that are operative in language. So according to Sunyavada, language, linguistic kind of apparatus that we carry in our minds, because at the root of it, language is a result of certain conceptual scheme. It all boils down to something happening inside our mind. So language, in that sense, is a kind of function of mind. And the main function of language is to help us apprehend things, to conceptualize it, such that the sense data that is coming to us becomes apprehensible, becomes understandable to us in a certain way. But according to Buddha, this is in this very act. The truth of the world is lost to us, because when we put it together in language, when we try to capitulate it in language, then we make it subject to certain conceptual schemes. And according to Buddha, especially the way his teachings are interpreted by Mahayana philosophers, any kind of schematization, any kind of conceptualizing schemes that we might want to be operative while we are saying something about the ultimate truth about the world, are going to be not complete in a certain sense, because all perspectives towards the world, whatever language we use, it will carry a certain kind of perspective along with it. So this way, Buddha, according to Mahayanists, was against any kind of dittivad or against any kind of philosophical formulation, or any kind of systematical formulation of his teaching, because that would have kind of fossilized it, or would have fixed it in a certain way, and reality is not kind of fixed according to Buddha. So we will come to these points later. But at the moment, we are talking about all this in the context of the schism that arose between Hinayana and Mahayana schools of Buddhism after Buddha's Mahaparinirvana. So these Mahayana philosophers, many of them took Buddha's silence as their focus point, and did not want to engage themselves in any systematic formulations of Buddha's philosophy. So the main focus was here between what was said by Buddha and what was not said by him. So Hinayanists want to focus on what he taught, or what he said during different discourses, and Mahayana, especially the Sunyavadian philosophers amongst the Mahayanists, wanted to focus on what he did not say. So having said that, next thing that we need to talk about here is the idea of dharma in that as we find it appearing in Hinayana philosophy. Now, Hinayana literature, as we know, it comprises of different Pitakas, and mainly it's a kind of putting together of Buddha's speeches on different occasions, and they have been verbatim more or less put down there. Also, in certain Pitakas, including Vinaya Pitak, it is a kind of canonical literature where some of the main ethical precepts of Buddhist philosophy are laid down, where all the rules that the monks should be following while staying in a monastery should be strictly followed are enumerated. But over and apart from that, we do not find many discussions on certain epistemological issues as we find in Mahayana philosophy. But importantly, we have a chunk, a good amount of literature that's generally known as Abhidhamma literature, where certain metaphysical issues are discussed and are formulated in a certain way in these texts. So the main crux of the teachings here is that everything in the world, all the objects in the world at a metaphysical level, could be explained in terms of what was called as dhammas. So, dharma, generally we take it to mean religion or the way, but in its metaphysical context, in Abhidhamma text, dhamma also refers to some of the ultimate constituent elements which come together and kind of put together entities before us. So, according to Abhidhamma idea, there are some kind of atomic entities which exist at the level of mind, which exists at the level of physical world, and so on and so forth. And these these minuscule atomic entities come together and in a certain way, and construct for us and put together for us what we see before us. So mental ideas would, in that sense, would be a result of certain certain dhamma dhatus put together in our consciousness. Similarly, physical world would is supposed to be comprised of different small elements. When they come together, they result in the evolution of certain entities, but since they have come together because of certain conditions, when those conditions go, those objects also disappear. So, according to them, it is this kind of origination is always dependent upon something else. So, origination, in that sense, origin of things or the originated things, are not real, because for their origin all the entities depend upon something else, namely the dhammas, and in that sense they cannot be absolute in themselves, because anything that requires something other than itself for its origin and sustenance cannot be in a certain way absolute in itself, cannot be complete in itself. So mainly Abhidhamma text talks about ephemeral nature of things, something that we call momentariness or Kshanikvad in Buddhism, and it also focuses on the fact that all the different entities in the world, which could be mental in nature or physical in nature, are a result of coming together of certain more subtle elements. So that's which were called dhammas by the Hinayanists. So that was the basic, that is the basic understanding that we find in the Abhidhamma text. And of course, we also know that, as we've already discussed, one of the main differences between Hinayana and Mahayana Buddhism is also that almost all, with a few exceptions, almost all the Hinayana texts are written in Pali language. And there are hardly any Mahayana texts to be found which are in Pali language, very rare exceptions. And so most of the Mahayana texts, we either find them in Sanskrit, or a good major chunk of them is discovered in Tibetan language, because many of the Mahayana texts were later on not only translated in Tibetan, but many commentaries were written by some of the Tibetan thinkers, and they are historically speaking they have been preserved in a more complete form than their Sanskrit counterparts. So this is also one of the minor differences between Hinayana and Mahayana Buddhism. After having this historical account, we'll talk further on the issues regarding Sunyavada philosophy in a few minutes. Thank you. Welcome back, viewers. So in our earlier section, we just talked about the difference between the Hinayana and Mahayana branches of Buddhism, So now we'll move on to some of the main tenets of Buddhism, and we need to understand here that there could be whatever differences regarding other issues, certain subtle issues regarding origination of the world, origination of things, and so on and so forth. But there are, all the schools of Indian of Buddhism, irrespective of their Hinayana or Mahayana affiliations, do believe in certain central Buddhist notions. So, and some of these central notions or main tenets in Buddhist philosophy are first, Four Noble Truths, and 12 linked chain, also called Dwadash Nidan Chakra, and the doctrine of momentariness, also called Kshanikvad, and their view of Pratityasamutpada, which is translated as dependent origination, and is known as Pratityasamutpada in Pali. So we'll talk about these central notions in Buddhism in briefly before we move on to Sunyavada. Because both the Hinayana and Mahayana philosophers do hold on to these central views, though their interpretations of these central notions are slightly different. So we'll talk about those differences later. But before we talk about these differences, we need to understand these central notions in Buddhism. So we can begin with the Four Noble Truths, which are also known Arya Satya. Now the first noble truth, as most of us would know, is dukkha, that there is suffering or there is pain. So the first observation that Buddha had was that there is immense amount of pain that we find in the world. So our human conditions are such that it involves a certain kind of suffering, as we know. That there's this famous anecdote, there's this famous story about Buddha that before he renounced the world, because he had a sight of a young child and then an old person, a deceased person, and finally a dead person. So this for Buddha, this was a moment of realization that there is nothing that stays permanently there in the world. That things, one fundamental, undeniable truth about the world is that everything here is undergoing perpetual flux. So things are undergoing perpetually through some change, and something that is there today would not be there tomorrow, would not be there in some other point of time. So sooner or later, all the things, including human beings, including us, are going to go. So, and apart from that, even while during our lifetime, we undergo several kind of afflictions, which includes diseases and several kind of mental agonies. Since change is the main truth about the world, we get attached to things, to people, and but those people and those things are not permanent. So our attachments and the happiness that we derive from our attachments to things and people is also not permanent. So, since those things or those people that we are attached to would go one day, so ultimately, the happiness that we may be deriving from the objects of our desires, the objects of our attachment, is ephemeral too, because those objects themselves are ephemeral. So, dukkha is something of an undeniable fact about the world, because the opposite of it, namely happiness, is always conditional. Our happiness is always dependent upon, in the empirical world at least, is always dependent upon something else. We become happy because of certain reasons. And all the reasons are ephemeral. All the objects which make us happy are ephemeral, are momentary. Therefore, pain is going to result sooner or later. So behind every moment of happiness, there is a moment of pain just lurking behind it. There is a moment of pain impending it. So therefore, dukkha or suffering is one of the undeniable fact in the world. Now, somebody may call that this looks like a very pessimistic kind of an idea about. This looks like a very pessimistic worldview, as if it's a philosophy which begins with the observation of this fundamental fact that there is suffering in the world, is more likely to take us in some kind of a pessimistic state of mind, and may not be such a good philosophy in soteriological terms. So, but what we need to look at here is that just like there is a reason for happiness, and when those reasons go, sooner or later dukkha results. Similarly, dukkha would also be impermanent in the same way. So, if we just like happiness goes because it has certain causes, so depending upon certain causes, there could be a way of removing suffering as well. Now, this realization brings us to the second noble truth, which is called samudaya. The second noble truth is samudaya basically means the arising of dukkha, or the cause of arising of dukkha, the cause of arising of pain. So if there is pain, since everything as a cause is dependent upon certain conditions, everything is originated depending upon certain other things. Similarly, dukkha also originates because of certain other factors. First truth is that there is dukkha. Second truth is that this dukkha must have a reason behind it. And it's generally considered that the main reason behind dukkha is the ignorance, and that brings us to the 12-linked chain, what we call as Dwadash Chakra. So, according to Buddhism, according to Buddhist philosophy, we get into the cycle of dukkha because we get into the cycle of these 12 links of a particular chain, which begins with ignorance. So when in our sort of ordinary state of mind in the world, we are afflicted with certain ignorance. We are afflicted with the lack of right knowledge about the world, which is called avidya in Pali, and is called avidya in Sanskrit. And the cause of ignorance, just like everything has a cause, so the cause of ignorance is the mental fomentations or volitions. The Pali term for which is sankhara, and the Sanskrit term for this is sanskara. So there are certain kind of sense impressions that we have been carrying on from our previous births, and these sense impressions make us produce certain predilections in us, which result in certain predispositions. within us. So, first of all, we must realize that the cause of pain is ignorance. Ignorance is there because, in a certain way, we are born with it because we carry sanskara in our consciousness even at the time of birth. And these sanskaras are the cause of certain mental predilections and which result in certain predispositions in the world. And the cause of it is a certain state of consciousness that we carry with ourselves, called vijnana in Pali and vijnana in Sanskrit. And this consciousness of ours is generally carries a kind of a conceptual scheme with itself, which results in what we call nama rupa, and then accordingly, we respond to these objects with having certain desires about them, and we try to sort of approach them with our six senses, which is called salayatana. And later on, it would result in a certain kind of desire to touch those objects. So that's called contact, which basically refers to sense-object contact, and this contact results in certain kind of vedana called feeling. And this feeling, if it is good, then it results in certain kind of cravings, longings, and desire, which results further in clinging, and which results in generation of factors for rebirth called bhava, and because of which we take birth, and then there is all the suffering back in the world, which is called jara maran. Meaning jara meaning decay, and maran of course means death. So we get back into that same cycle. So the cause of this is how the cause of the dukkha is explained in Buddhist philosophy, and this also explains why scholars, people charging Buddhism of pessimism, an answer could be given to them from this point of view, that Buddhism does not propound that there is pain in the world and is going to stay. It's only stating that there is pain in the world, and since it has causes, therefore it could be removed as well. So the emphasis here is on removal of pain, which might result in the opposite of it, or which would make us transcend this any kind of pain or pleasure altogether. So this way, we cannot charge of Buddhism of pessimism. Now, going on to the third noble truth, which is called Nirodha, which means stoppage or removal. So the third noble truth is translated as that there is removal, there is possible removal of suffering. Since there is suffering in the world and it has causes, it's caused because depending upon certain factors. Therefore, if those factors are understood and removed, and subsequently removed, then what originates as a result of those factors would automatically get sublated, would automatically disappear. So the third noble truth is about cessation of suffering, that there is a possible removal of suffering. So if we understand how the pain originates because of this 12 linked chain, if we have an understanding of how these 12 factors get us into a cycle of decay and death, a proper understanding of it might take us out of this cycle. of Jaramaran. So this is the third noble truth, and the fourth and final noble truth is called Magga or Marg. So the fourth noble truth is that there is a way, there is a path, meaning there is a way out of suffering. So there is a system, there is a possibility of following a path which would lead us to liberation from any kinds of suffering. So, so talking again about the charge of pessimism against Buddhism. So, fourth noble truth makes it very clear that that the entire enterprise, the entire reason why Buddhists try to propound a certain kind of philosophy is for the removal of suffering, and any philosophy talking about removal of suffering cannot be pessimistic in nature. So, so there is a way, there is a path, which basically means that freedom from suffering is possible by practicing what we call Eightfold Path or Dwadash Nidana Chakra. Having an understanding of the reasons for the arising of avidya, we may get out of the cycle of avidya. So now these four noble truths are something that both Hinayana and Mahayana adhere to. They have sort of no issues, no debate about this. Both of them unanimously believe in the Four Noble Truths. Now the Eightfold Path, which would result in which is tantamount to what we call Marga in Buddhism, comprises of Sammaditthi, called Samyak Drishti in Sanskrit, which means right way of looking at things, right vision, proper view. So if we have proper view towards things, it would be considered as a virtue, as a part of Eightfold Path. Then Samma Sankappa, meaning Samyak Sankalp, right intent in life. Samma Vacha, meaning Samyak Vak, meaning right speech. Samma Kamanta, meaning Samyak Karma, meaning right action. Samma Ajiva, meaning in Sanskrit Samyak Ajivika, meaning getting your livelihood in the proper, in ethically proper way. And then Samma Vayama, meaning right kind of effort. Samma Sati, right kind of awareness or mindfulness. And Samma Samadhi, having the right state of mind. These eight different steps of the same path, if followed, would result in a liberation according to Buddhism. So, so there may be difference regarding what would count as Sammaditthi in Hinayana and Mahayana Buddhism, but both of them would unanimously believe that Eightfold Path is the way out of the cycle of pain in our lives. So now the fourth and probably the most important point in this context is that of Pratityasamutpada. The idea behind Pratityasamutpada is it's generally translated as dependent origination. So the main idea here is that things do not have any absolute kind of nature about themselves, because and the reason of that is that they are dependently originated. So the overall idea here is that since any entity in the world for its origin depends upon something else, therefore it could never be self-complete. Therefore there is nothing, so to speak, absolute about that entity. So that is the main, so to speak, idea behind this. But as we were talking about it earlier, this is the main point of conflict between the Hinayana and the Mahayana branches of Buddhism. Both of them do believe that things are dependently originated, but Hinayana philosophers, Abhidhamma philosophers have a different interpretation of it, and the Sunyavadin philosophers have a very different kind of interpretation of it. So, as we talked about it earlier, according to Hinayana philosophers, dependent origination basically means that there are certain constituent elements which are we could call, so to speak, the ultimate constituents of the world. Whether when we talk about entities, those could be mental in nature and physical in nature. So any mental episode, mental entities, or any physical entities are a result of coming together of this subtle atomic ultimate constituent elements. So, so to speak, nothing is real in the world in the absolute sense of the term, because everything is momentary. Both Hinayana and Mahayana philosophers subscribe to this view. But according to Abhidhamma text, there is these Dhamma dhatus, these Dhamma, are the ultimate truth about the world. So everything ultimately can be explained in terms of these Dhamma, and that remains, so to speak, the ultimate truth about the world according to the Hinayanist. Now, the Mahayana philosophers, especially Sunyavadins, are opposed to this view, because according to them, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that includes even what Hinayanists call Dhamma, the ultimate constituent elements. According to them, everything in the world is of the nature of Shunya, meaning that ultimately it is void in nature. Since so their interpretation of Pratityasamutpada is different in the sense that according to them, everything is dependently originated, and it appears to be there. Appears to be there as some kind of real entity, but on a closer examination we find that there is nothing real about it. Now, it also calls for a certain discussion regarding what counts as real according to Buddhist philosophers. Now, according to Buddhist philosophers, especially the Sunyavadins, real would mean something that is able to abide by itself. Say, for example, any entity in the world. We know that any entity in the world does not abide by itself, which includes us as well. So, every moment, our life depends upon number of certain other factors. Each moment we are breathing in and breathing out, so our sustenance, our life depends upon certain other elements, factors which are extraneous to us, and the moment these conditions, these factors which constitute the arising and sustenance of us, the moment these factors would go, the person, him or herself, would also go. So we only appear to be there in the real sense of the term, to be there as if in absolute terms. But that's only the apparent part of it. If we do a closer examination, we find that we are also dependently originated, and so are our ideas that are floating in our mind all the time. So there are certain things in the world because of certain sanskaras, because of certain sense impressions, our being in the world, our surroundings, and so on and so forth. We come to have certain conceptual schemes regarding the world around us, and depending upon those conceptual schemes, we form a certain kind of idea about the objects in the world. So whether we talk about the mental ideas, whether we talk about the physical world around us, everything appears to be there as if all by itself. But on a closer examination, when we realize that these are dependently originated, then we know that there is nothing, so to speak, abiding about them, and there is nothing, so to speak, real about them. So basically the idea here is that we hold things generally in our generally in our lives to be real. We forget that things are ephemeral and they would go in the course of events in the world. And one of the main reasons, as Mahayanists later on analyze, is the way language functions. So there's a lot of emphasis upon how we form judgments about things, the language part of it, the mental part of it, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the language part of it, we generally see that language, whenever we know something, it is always within language. It's just very difficult to talk about any kind of knowing which is extra linguistic in nature. So otherwise it would be not expressible, at least. So whatever we know, or whatever knowing that happens only because of and within language. Now, language is such that language seems to be more permanent than the nature of things. So we could understand it this way, that the word table has been enduring for probably thousands of years, and in comparison, if we look at the actual object that it refers to, the particular object, the concrete particular material object that it refers to, it has a much smaller duration. So, since we think in language, it gradually, subtly reinforces this idea in us that probably things are more enduring, at least, and we tend to believe, because language is a much larger phenomena than the actual existence of particular objects. So if we have this tendency to believe, because our consciousness was always there as if linguisticized. So we don't know what it is for the consciousness to be apart from the language. Therefore, we think that objects are enduring, just as the categories because of which we understand them are. So the idea here is that these categories of mind, linguistic categories, through which we know objects, they seem to be enduring, they seem to be almost as if permanent. We come to have this tendency of believing that the objects around us are there to stay. But and this results, as we spoke about it earlier, this results in certain kind of clinging towards those objects. And we don't realize that these objects are not permanent, and since they would disappear, depending upon the causes, it would ultimately result in certain kind of pain. So the idea here is that the main cause of suffering is to hold them as in a certain way permanent, wrong way of looking at them. So the ignorance, according to the Mahayanist philosophers, is that we believe that things have a certain nature of their own, certain swabhava, which abides in them, because of which things are what they are, and then things appear to us, because of which things appear to us in a certain way, invoking certain kind of predispositions towards them. So this is how they would interpret the idea of ignorance, which is the first link in the Dwadash Nidan Chakra. So if we understand the way our mind functions, how we form judgments regarding the world, and then when we change our way of looking at the things, and realizing that there is nothing absolute about the world, so therefore there could be no absolute right way there could be no one absolute philosophical way of looking at the things. After this realization, we probably could lead to liberation. So the main idea here is that things in themselves do not have anything abiding about themselves, so there could not be any permanent, any decisive, overarching, all-inclusive way of defining the objects. There can be no absolute way of defining the objects. So later on we will talk about what Shunyavadins mean about when they say that things are shunya. What do they mean by the idea of shunyata of things? So for the time being, this is where we end. Thank you.
On that note, I would like to thank sir for this very enriching discussion, and thank you dear friends for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.